Hello.
Thank you.
So Bryan, in case anyone in the audience is not familiar, founded Braintree in 2007. I think everyone is probably familiar with that company, had a pretty solid exit to PayPal. And in 2014, he created the OS Fund, which is a $100 million investment vehicle, which has a pretty unique thesis. So why don't I just kick it off by having you explain the investment thesis behind OS Fund to the crowd. Can we get Bryan's mic going? Anyone? Here, you want to steal mine?
Yeah. So I think as evidenced by the previous panel.
There we go.
Humans, we love to play games. And the games that they were talking about is who's the rising star at a fund? What multiple can you get? What's the return on your fund? Are you in the top quartile of the returns? And there's this interesting book by James Carse titled Finite Games and Infinite Games. And finite games are one where the rules of the game, where there's a start point and an end point, and the objective is to win the game, like basketball or soccer. An infinite game is the players of the game have a single objective, which is they want to continue playing the game together. That's it. And so within that gameplay, you have all the incentives. And so I think the reason why I created OS Fund is when I look at the future, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, I kind of imagine the future as having the force of a Category 5 hurricane and it bearing down the human race. And if you size up our existing structures and technology and abilities, I kind of have the image it's going to devastate us and leave us without water and power and internet connectivity and stuff like that. And so
where did you get that idea?
So in other words, okay, we'll take this a side step and we'll come back to the fund. Steven Pinker has made a great argument that the world has never been a better place. Violence is down, standard of living is up overall. There's a couple primary factors that are driving the future, and that is specifically the pace of change is increasing, and we know that. And the pace of change puts stress on society. How fast can our institutions adopt? How fast can our systems adopt? How fast can our beliefs adopt, et cetera, et cetera. And the second thing is the complexity of society is increasing. So if we lose power and we can't charge our devices or have internet connectivity, society kind of comes to a screaming halt.
It's a big problem.
It's a big problem. So we're extremely fragile. And so if we say, if the future is something like this, that is a certain form of complexity and a certain form of accelerated change, and we size ourselves up and say, are we up to the task? I side on the answer to think, I don't think so. And so the entirety of OS Fund is to invest in technologies. Yes.
I understand why, your view of the problems, but why did you decide that venture capital was the answer?
So if we look at this scenario and we say, what things might we build which would contribute to greater adaptability, greater capability set, increase the probability that we could thrive in such an environment. And my conclusion was that the hard sciences are an underinvested yet very promising area. So for example, synthetic biology is really interesting. The fact that you take a microorganism like yeast or E. coli, and you could program it like we program computers to produce fragrances or flavors or even do something more complex like carbon capture. But building this infrastructure where we can program biology, to me, is a fundamental building block of the future. So in other words, what toolkits do we have to deal with an emergent future that's very complex? Genetics is another one. Mm-hmm. If we can sequence the genome at a low cost, and we have tools like CRISPR and others to edit the genome, we now have a toolkit that can allow us to ask any question we can about humans, or I guess anything with genetic structures.
All right, so we're playing infinite games. You've also framed the investment thesis as investing for self-interest. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
I think a lot of people play within the games that they're given. For example, a current social media game is how many followers do you have on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube, etc. That is a game that a lot of people said they're willing to play. And a lot of people didn't invent that game, they just play that game. And the key for me is I would like there to be a greater focus on the things we invest that increase the likelihood that we as a species will thrive. And that means that, one, we need to acknowledge the future is going to be different than the past, and we just somehow get our frame around what it might look like in terms of the pace of change and adaptability, and that if investors really saw this potential, they would invest in things that would allow them to continue their self-interest of playing the investment game. But if we don't build the toolkits that allow us to thrive in this new environment, nobody's playing any games. Or at least we're playing games where we're hunting and gathering for food. And
So how is your fund different than from any other standard biotech or life sciences firm?
We have a lot of things in common with those firms. The observation I would make is that most of the wealth in the world is maintained by people who do not have scientific expertise, like myself. I made money in a business that was not not science-based. And the question became, when I started my fund, is could I, as an entrepreneur, without any investing experience, invest in hard science endeavors? Could I invest in synthetic biology and genetics and artificial intelligence and space? And that's why I wanted to do it on my own, is I couldn't go out to LPs and say, hey, would you like to invest in this, because I have no idea what I'm doing, I have no track record. So the past 3 years has been me building, working with a team, and we have been figuring out how we systematically approach investing in hard science. And we published a playbook to, we open sourced our internal vetting process to say, if you have an interest in investing in hard science, you can follow this guide and feel confident in investing your money in hard science by walking through this process.
All right, and we'll get to that in a minute too, but I'm curious. So LPs would probably laugh you out the door if you said, all right, I started this payments company and now I'm going to invest in life sciences. I totally get that, but wouldn't entrepreneurs react the same way? How do you convince them that they should take your money over someone who has, you know, a PhD or someone who has been investing in biotech for decades?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had the same question. I thought no one's going to want my money. Turns out, it turns out that there is value to be had in a conversation. So even though I didn't initially structure or understand, if we drive into the details of, okay, we have this yeast, how are we going to program this thing to the following? Even though I couldn't add value in that level initially.
What's the name of this yeast company?
Ginkgo Bioworks.
Got it, okay.
And the value I've had is having this conversation of, well, what do we develop first? And how do we create the lowest risk entry point? And how do we build for the next stage? And so I found that there's actually a very productive dialogue that goes on. And the fact that I'm so naive is actually really helpful, that I can ask questions about these guys. So for example, one of the things that has been the biggest lesson for me, and one of the bigger lessons in investing in science, is when scientific endeavors build something to bet on a binary outcome. It either works or it doesn't. That's a bad investment because your risk is so high. If the company is building a toolkit that enables the continuous exploration of a field and makes money on the continuous exploration where they share in the discovery, that's a good investment in science. And so I primarily have invested in tool-making companies that enable scientific discovery. And that enables them to have very long runways and not contingent upon them making breakthroughs to survive.
Mm-hmm. And so 3 years in now, have you found the landscape is rich with investment opportunities, or are you having to really go out there and, you know, pound the pavement to find the good stuff?
No, my biggest problem is we don't have enough money, for sure. And specifically for follow-on investments and the new deals coming our way. To give you an idea, for example, of how fast some of these things are moving, and many of you may know this, is given the lower cost of sequencing and given our abilities to write genetic code, over the past couple of years, there are now 2,400 trials going on in gene editing. That's in a matter of years. It's an explosion of industry and commerce and the questions that people ask based upon the tools they have to work with. So we are constrained by the tools we have to work with, and once we have those tools then inform the questions we can ask.
And so what's driving that explosion? Is that just technological advances or more money coming into it, more entrepreneurs interested in it? What's the...
For example, Illumina has largely driven the genome sequencing, where they now can sequence a genome at roughly $1,000. Mm-hmm. And getting that cost down to an affordable number is actually really interesting. And then, of course, CRISPR and Cas9, other gene editing tools that have come about in the past couple of years, that has basically given the toolkit where people can say, what can I do? And that's in agriculture, it's in humans, it's in everything.
And just one more question back to the fund. Because you are so mission driven, do you, and because you are a single LP, it's just your money, do you prioritize financial returns in the same way that a traditional venture firm might, versus would you be willing to invest in a company that fits your mission but probably isn't going to be such a good business?
We prioritize financial returns like everyone else. And I do so for infinite gameplay. If the money comes back, I play more games.
Got it. So talk to me, what's the most out there idea that you've backed?
Likely planetary resources, which they're trying to mine an asteroid. And the thesis behind that is getting things into space is very costly. But if you could create a 7-Eleven in space where you could refuel things, that'd be really helpful. They're trying to create a fuel source in space.
Who's a potential customer there?
So for example, if the satellite companies who put up a satellite for GPS or radio or whatever the case may be, when there are systems out of fuel, it's done. You can't just send up a refueling truck, refuel the satellite, and you're good to go. There's no refueling in space. And getting fuel in space is extremely expensive. So if you could actually get fuel from asteroids in low Earth orbit, you can refuel satellites. And what Bezos is trying to do with Blue Origin, you need a fuel source for these things.
And what's the timeline for a company like that? When you invest in the early stage, I assume, how many years before you can actually see if the product works, let alone whether or not they could get a customer?
Yeah, and so to your question, they are I guess pun intended, the most out there as well. But the key for them is, and we've spent a lot of time talking about this, is how do you create a viable short-term business on the way to this long-term value creation? Because taking this moonshot of this binary outcome is not something I want to support. So I like the idea, and we've been working very hard to create a systematic way to make money between now and that endpoint.
And so what are some of the ways?
So I'm not at liberty to say, but that's the conversation we have with all the companies. How do you not bet your survival on a breakthrough?
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, how do you become okay with putting your personal money into some of these crazy things? You mentioned that you have this open source diligence method. Can you explain more detail how that actually works?
I suppose I'm okay putting a lot of capital in this because I sincerely believe that if we don't build the toolkit for the future to thrive, that having this form of currency doesn't matter.
Okay, so you're personally okay with it, but I guess when you're choosing different investments, you still, like you said, don't necessarily have the expertise to evaluate them. So how do you actually get there?
I've learned a lot over the course of investing 3 years. I've spent a lot of time on personal development, but I also have a team. I have 7 PhDs on my team that help vet these deals. So it's not the case that I'm going in here and doing this analysis myself. I would not do that. But I have a robust team that actually knows what they're talking about, so we do it together.
Well, I'm curious. I feel like we can't talk about moonshots, particularly in biotech and life sciences, without bringing up Theranos. And I feel like that really got a lot of investors scared to dive into areas where they don't have expertise, and or to rely on the diligence of another firm that appears to know what they're talking about, but as it turns out, they misjudged. And so I'm curious, do you view that as just kind of inevitable? You're going to have a couple Theranoses every once in a while, and hopefully they don't get to the size that Theranos got? Or do you think that it's able to be avoided with diligence?
It's unfortunate when a single event disproportionately defines society. And I guess what comes to mind is the gentleman who was the shoe bomber who tried to blow up the airplane in the U.S. And then it created this thing where now everyone in the entire world has to take their shoes off when they go to the airport for security. And Theranos of course, occupies a lot of mental real estate. And immediately that's the heuristic. That's a shortcut people say is, well, if it happened to Theranos, well, then it's going to happen everywhere. And the purpose of writing this investor playbook was to systematically analyze and de-risk an investment so that otherwise it's lazy to say everything's like Theranos, therefore I can't invest. when in reality, it was clearly the case that there was not proper diligence done in the deal. So I am not influenced by Theranos. I trust process over everything in doing it.
So let's look forward then. Where are you putting your money in 2018? Are there particular areas or trends that you're super excited about?
Synthetic biology, genetics, and the brain.
And so what are some examples of cool technology that you've seen in those areas? Sorry, I should say cool and investable.
There's an explosion of tools that need to be created for the revolution in genomics. If we can sequence a genome at $1,000, and therefore we can get a couple million genomes, and then we have these tools to edit the genomes for whatever reason, whether it be disease and dysfunction, whether it be improvement of a certain thing, the toolkits needed for that entire ecosystem are massive. And so I'd say that is one in particular. Synthetic biology, when synthetic biology first became a big thing, the target was ethanol. There was the government invested a ton of money, and everybody went after ethanol.
That didn't go so well.
It didn't, exactly. Because, and the reason why, this is my personal opinion, is because in any given technology, you need to commence at complexity 0 and then work your way up the complexity scale. And ethanol is a complexity curve of like a 6 or 7. And so it's not the right place to start. And so the companies I've invested in have basically, in my opinion, done the right things of building the base level toolkits to start with complexity level 0. Once you solve 0, go to 1, and then go to 2. But you systematically tackle the complexity. Otherwise, it's just a binary bet.
So do you see more investors getting interested in these areas, or do you think they're being like the lazy Theranos, I don't want to touch it?
I wish that, in many ways, investors are the a influential permission structure for the future we collectively create. So the people in this room have the power of saying yes or no to entrepreneurs who have ideas that create things in the world that dramatically influence the world we live in. And so in many ways, the people here and everywhere else are the future creators because capital is a permission structure. And I therefore would like to see more capital in the world going towards the building blocks that ensure a future that we survive in.
And so just real quick, because we only have, I think, a minute left, how deployed is your fund?
I'm sorry?
How deployed is your $100 million fund?
We need more capital.
So are you going to raise a new fund, and will it have outside LPs?
Yes.
Fantastic. And then one more question. What is the most rewarding part of jumping from entrepreneur to investor?
I get a backstage access to many of the coolest things happening on planet Earth. And I get to see the future 5, 10, 15 years before the people. And I'm able to be involved with these critical decision-making moments that happen. So for example, when new tools arrive on the scene, a revolution happens where the old is pushed to the side, a new opening is made, and in that opening of a revolution, important decisions are made, and then it kind of collapses and kind of creates a new norm. And I love being in that opening where these new worlds are exploding into new norms.
I agree. That sounds really cool. All right. Thank you for the inspiration. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Bryan.